right, let's get started then. So this is our second LIP call. And on the agenda for today, the main topic is our sole LIP candidate, which is LIP 25, Extensible Governance Contract. And I think since last time, there was a formal draft LIP created for this proposal, checked into the LIP repo recently. And Nico, do you want to give an update on draft LIP and where you think both the design and parameter discussion are at this point before we open it up for discussion with this group? Nico?
Sorry, my sound was muted.
Oh, did you hear what I said?
Not entirely. Sorry.
Okay. So I asked if you wanted to give an update on where this LIP 25 draft is for the extensible governance contract, as well as where you think the design discussion as well as the initial parameter value discussion is at.
Right. So the LIP itself has just been submitted as a draft. There has also been an extra issue opened, which is issue number 30, which is a separate issue to discuss the initial values for the parameters. Well, the main parameter, or the only one, being the delay for update execution at the moment. In terms of the design discussion itself, I'd say there are still some open areas of discussion. One example would be the exact details of the ACL, whether we would be going for something like a role-based access system or just something that we write from scratch. Another topic for discussion, for example, is whether we would use a global delay for execution updates, for execution of updates, or a modular delay. And if so, how that modular delay would look like. Those are some of the open discussion areas, I'd say. And I guess they also, of course, have an impact on the discussion for what the initial values should be. If we decide we would run with a global parameter for the delay, then the outcome of that discussion for the initial value would likely be much different from a discussion about a modular delay parameter. So that's where that LIP is at, I think.
Cool. So shall we go through each of those items right now to see if we can make progress on any of those discussions, starting with role-based authentication versus address-based authentication? Do you have your own personal view on this, or is it pretty open right now, discussion-wise?
Yeah, we can run through those items right now. I guess for the first one, I haven't really considered role-based access all that much, but the thing that I had against it right now was I think we would end up with a situation whereby we would create a role for each actor. And then in that case, a role-based system doesn't really do much extra for us, because I doubt we'll be reusing roles that often.
Just to make it more concrete, a role-based would be like security committee has these rules, and end user proposers have these rules and whatnot. And then like addresses would be given roles, and then those roles would adhere to certain parameters. That's right. An address base is just the parameters apply to each address.
Yeah, exactly. One example, for example, could be a role that is called the pauser, which allows a user to call pause and unpause. But then again, how would you use that same role if you want different delays for different actors that use that role, right? Then you're probably better off just putting those values on the addresses directly instead of using roles to sort of wrap around that.
Yeah, I can definitely see a scenario where it devolves into the equivalent of address-based authentication if you have a separate role for each address, and because the rules for each role are so unique to that given address, you end up not reusing those roles. So I can definitely see that. I think the main reason that I like the idea is that it feels more flexible than the address-based system, where yes, in the worst case scenario, it ends up being equivalent to the address-based system, but there are scenarios where you can reuse roles. And one thought was that if you have a pauser role as well as a parameter setter role, the parameter setter role might have a particular delay, and you might give that same role to different addresses. And that's actually meaningful because you have the same rules apply to each of those addresses. Or an example that Doug provided with a security committee, if you have a security committee role, each address that's a part of the security committee has that same role. So I definitely think in the worst case scenario, it ends up devolving into one role per address. But because there feels like there's scenarios where a role could be reusable, that's why I found it appealing, and that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I can see your point, but I also guess that depends on how you design the roles themselves, of course. So if we go with a role-based access system, I think we should put some serious thought in about how we actually design the roles to avoid too much duplication. And also, of course, how the time delay parameter would fit into that if we were going for a modular delay.
Yeah, one other reason that I found the role-based system appealing is, let me just bring up the example that I was thinking of when I created my comment. Oh, I think the scenario I was thinking about is, what if you wanted to have an address where it can, let's say, pause without a delay, but it can set parameters with a delay. And in the role-based system, there felt like there was a pretty elegant way to handle this, which is you have your pauser role and you have your param setter role, and the same address is assigned both roles. And the delay on the param setter role might be X number of blocks, and then the delay on the pauser role is 0. And that, in my eyes, felt like a clean way to reason about it, which is another reason that I found it appealing.
Yeah. As I said, I can definitely see the benefits of it, and also how it could perhaps provide a little more oversight when looking at who owns, or at least who owns certain roles, or at least who has access to certain roles, instead of having to produce a whole list of methods a certain actor is able to call, and then their time delay for like each separate method. So yeah, I can see the benefit of that. And if we were to reuse roles, I can probably see the benefit of not having to set all of that state all over again for a separate actor, and just set a role for that actor.
Right. So to put it more concretely, we have a bunch of parameters in the protocol, such as like the unbonding period, the inflation rate. And if we wanted to have an actor be able to set all of those parameters on a delay, we would have to have, let's say the number of parameters is 10. That means that we would need to do 10 storage writes in the contract in order to authorize that actor to call all those parameter setter functions. So yeah, I think from an implementation detail standpoint, that's something worth considering as it involves a little more storage load on the contract itself.
Practically, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, okay, the Live Peer Inc. multi-sig is going to have the ability to execute all these different types of updates, and we would like to shift that to like the binding voting contract to be able to update these, institute these types of updates. And so I don't know what world I see where there are like many actors who have various permissions to invoke different types of updates, though maybe that's just being short-sighted.
I think that's definitely a fair point. I think that some of this discussion is out of a desire to maintain flexibility because, one, we don't know what the exact details of that binding voting system will look like. And two, it also, in my view, seems unlikely that you would want a binding voting system that works, that has the ability to change all parameters in the same exact way. And this thought arises out of thoughts shared by other people before around different parameters might require different levels of expertise to set. So you might think that setting one parameter, it's perfectly fine to have it be set via the binding voting system and that's it. But maybe a different parameter, you want additional input in some way. So you might use the binding voting system along with something else and combine those two signals. I acknowledge that this is a very abstract conversation, right? But that's kind of the nature of what we're dealing with here. So yeah, I totally hear you on like it not being clear what other actors would look like in the future, but yeah, just voicing that the reason that we're having this discussion in the first place is to maintain the flexibility going forward.
Okay, so I guess one consequence of that, though, if you combine that with like the practicality, it's like it's okay if there's a lot of state that needs to be updated in order to introduce like a new actor or a new rule, because practically I don't see that occurring very frequently, right? I see it occurring as we introduce the binding voting system. I see it maybe if there's some evolution of governance to enable this kind of like second type of binding voting system combined with other actor in order to institute something. It's like that's a huge, big decision. Like using the flexible tools to do 20 transactions in order to configure everything correctly is not a huge deal.
Is it not a huge deal? That sounds pretty operationally cumbersome. And
sorry.
To submit 20 transactions, like once a year or something, or once every 6 months.
yeah, I mean, I think if we can avoid operational overhead, that would be nice, right? So I think that's worth taking into consideration.
I think the current discussion is very much about how many actors we'll have concurrently at one given time. But I think we could also consider the scenario whereby we have a certain actor which has a role assigned to him, but we have to upgrade that actor. Let's say it's a smart contract that implements a binding voting system, and we'd have to redeploy that binding voting system, but it should have the same role, right? It's just an upgrade of that code. Then with a role-based access system, we would just have to reassign the role instead of assigning whatever parameters or methods it's allowed to call. which would be pretty significant if we would implement a role-based access system. And I also consider a potential future whereby we have one binding voting system, but it's sort of like a court system whereby you can go to a higher court with the result of the first one, and then you can sort of appeal the decision that's been made. So that would require a different voting system as well with different permissions. So yeah. I think it's very much a trade-off between, do we think the additional engineering work to implement role-based access is worth it against the efficiency gains we can have down the line, the reduction of operational costs?
Right. Well, with the role-based system, I think it's worth noting that there are open source libraries that we can use for that, right?
Yeah, I think so. Although coming back to where our delay would fit into that, I'm not sure if we could reuse them. I haven't looked into any of these libraries yet. I also don't know how well vetted they are, of course.
Right. So I think that's worthwhile considering, like how well vetted they are. I think it's also worth noting that when we roll this, like if this is something that gets deployed to mainnet, it's probably something that will at some point go through some sort of security review, whether it's standalone or as a part of a bundle of other upgrades. Whether that security review is like a commissioned audit or it's part of like a bounty program, I think that's to be decided. But one thing that we could consider is if we're using an open source library, one, is the open source library already vetted and already audited? And two, if it's not, can consider including it in the scope of our security review, however we go about that security review.
Yeah, that sounds quite reasonable. I don't think, yeah, that should be a deterrent. So yeah.
Yeah. It also feels like to me like something like a role-based system or even an ACL generally, like I'm wary of implementing those from scratch because those just feel like components that should be standardized. And what I'm not sure about is the state of standardization of these components. So maybe that it's not as far along, but I think that's also something worth taking consideration if like these things are fairly standardized at this point. I think it's worthwhile considering using them as opposed to rolling everything ourselves, unless we actually need to.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I guess we'll have to look into how well we can use some of those implementations for our own purposes and how well they fit in there. Depending on how generic they are, I think it should fit pretty well. But yeah, I'm just thinking about the delay parameter. I think from an access control standpoint on like which methods an actor is allowed to call, they're sort of all similar in that regard. So yeah.
All right, so it sounds like we have it to do. It sounds like we're leaning towards using a role-based system if the complexities and trade-offs and kind of trusting the code that's written for those and the engineering work required is worth it. Mm-hmm. So let's do that research.
And look, or at least reading between the lines, I kind of gauge that having a modular delay that's incorporated into this potential role-based access system is the desirable way forward as well, instead of like a global defined parameter.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by modular delay? That means a per action specific delay.
If it's, for example, defined within a role-based access system, I imagine it would be, for example, oh, you want to call pause, then your delay is set to to X, but that delay is actually set when setting the access rules itself.
So it's per role.
Yeah, I guess you could say per role, but then you also have the question about which role can call which methods, and you can also say, okay, for each method that delay could be different, I guess.
Right, so I'm envisioning a grid with the roles down the left, the actions across the top, and then in each box there is a, you know, can this role call this, or, you know, execute this update, and what is the delay parameter for that role?
Yeah, I guess it also depends on how we expect someone to call an update. I guess it could be, for example, if you would consider a pauser role that's allowed to call pause and unpause, I could see potential where you could assign a different delay per actor, but for that specific role, right? And I think that might be the most desirable way to implement that, as you mentioned, so per role based instead of per method.
What's that mean? Per actor, per role. So like if you and I are each pausers, we have the pauser role, but we would have different delays. Wouldn't that make us different roles?
Yeah, so that's an open area of discussion actually. I could see potentially having a pause role that allows you to call the pause and unpause functions, but then have the delay be a separate parameter, and that would allow LivePeer Inc. to, for example, pause and unpause on no delay, but have a binding voting system that does that is able to pause and unpause on some delay.
Yeah, I think it might be worthwhile to just highlight the most likely scenario where we might want a modular delay. And at the moment, that seems to be at Genesis, if the system is deployed, as has been discussed, the existing multisig would still have permissions to update parameters, do code upgrades, pause and unpause, etc. There's an argument for limiting the power of that multisig such that the multisig can change parameters, but on a delay. It can change code, but on a delay. But it can pause and unpause without a delay as kind of a fail-safe safety, so that instead of having arbitrary power, it is limited to the scope of the pause and unpause action. And that feels like to me like concretely the actual scenario where you want different delays for different things.
Yeah, I kind of agree there. Yeah.
So it feels like, unless there's anyone else that has comments on this, it feels like we're like modular delay is the direction that we're going in, and how it's actually implemented is dependent on, a little bit dependent on some of the role-based access control research to decide how the modular delay is actually implemented, whether it be on a per role basis or it's like on a per role per action basis. So it feels like, yeah, we need to get to the to-do of role-based research around that implementation before we can make a decision on how to implement the modular delay, right?
Yeah, that seems about right. Although I guess we could have like a discussion about some sensible defaults to use. For example, like the unbonding period, or like something a little longer than the unbonding period, which could be like a default for an actor that isn't a LivePeer Inc. multisig or the owner of the governance contract. So yeah,
You want to switch over to, I think that was the last topic that you mentioned, right? Which is the initial parameters. So we have to-dos for the first two, and we can talk about the suggested defaults now.
Yeah, indeed. So I suggested for initial values, I sort of wrote up this issue to consider a modular sort of access-based system already. And I proposed an initial state for the governance contract whereby, as we already discussed, the live peering multisig would retain the ability to pause and unpause the protocol on no delay, as well as execute code upgrades on no delay initially. This would allow for maximum flexibility, but also like already provide that base layer for removing a little bit of that control step by step. And then the live peering multisig would also be allowed to execute parameter updates on, I wrote here a 1.5 times the unbonding lock period delay, which would give ample time to any stakeholder to exit the protocol and unbond and withdraw and sell their LPT even after a decision has been made. But this period could also be shorter or longer, of course. That's the open area of discussion. It's just like an initial value put forth there.
Right, I know that Doug was asking about the unbonding lock period specifically in the discussion issue. So should we start with that? Doug, did you have any additional color that you wanted to add to your question?
Yeah, I think Nico just addressed it. I was just curious why that value was suggested initially, and I guess my speculation was right. It was that, okay, so a user knows that this change is coming, they disagree with it, they have enough time to observe the change and to exit the system prior to that change taking effect, which is a nice property of a good governance system, that people have a choice and an ability to exit if they don't want to adhere to the decision being put upon them, right? So it seems reasonable.
Yeah, I guess the duration of this is very much decided by whether we expect people to exit already if the LIP process is still taking place and the vote is still taking place before it has actually concluded and been executed and staged on chain, or should we expect people to only consider updates once they are actually staged on chain through the governance contract? So that would affect the duration of that parameter. If in the first case, I guess it could be way shorter. In the latter case, I guess something like 10 days, which is like what it is now, what it is set now, would be sufficient, I guess.
Yeah, good point. Like essentially they would see it coming, right? The poll would be going on, the execution may not occur immediately. So setting it shorter might be reasonable. The other input into that is the unbonding lock period could theoretically change. Like, I don't know if you guys remember, but the original proposal was that it was something like 2 or 3 months instead of 7 days, and 7 days felt like kind of temporary during the alpha. I don't know if it's likely the community would actually want to extend it, even though there's some good arguments for like further aligning people who stake with the protocol longer term. But yeah, it would not be reasonable to not be able to change or make an update for a 4-month period while it was just sitting there staged. So that's acknowledging it would have to be shorter than the unbonding lock period. So therefore, combined with what you said, people can see the results coming, they can do their research, they can kind of see where the community is leaning, they should be able to act quicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Although the question is how which stakeholder groups are expected to participate actively in that governance process. I think delegators are less likely to open up the Explorer once in a while and check that process. So for them, it would be, I guess, more helpful to have a longer unbonding, to have a longer period here as compared for orchestrators, which would be regularly checking the Explorer or the governance status of certain proposals. So Yeah, I guess it's sort of also which stakeholder groups do we want to take into account the most here, or which ones do we like to cater to? I guess all of them, but there's some trade-offs we have to make.
A related point is just like, I guess if you want your vote to count, you can't unbond until the voting period ends. So for
Yeah.
anything that's contentious where you don't know where it's going to swing, you need to leave your stake bonded.
Yeah, I think that's an important part for any like dissenting voice. And also if something's swayed at the last minute by like a large token holder who changes their mind or weighs in at the end, that could really change things. So I guess I'd caution against any sort of overlap.
Yeah, along those lines, I would probably suggest assuming that people are bonded until the poll is over and basing the decision of how long the delay is off of that, and not making any assumptions about people having the ability to unbond beforehand. For those reasons, and it's also just simpler to reason about.
Yeah, I think I agree there. In terms of not being able to exit the protocol if you, for example, voted yes on a proposal, I think it sounds like a nice idea, but I'm not sure how practical it is from an implementation standpoint in the protocol at this point. So yeah.
You're saying that you would prefer not to explore the possibility of having people be bonded for longer if they vote yes? Is that what you're saying? Sorry, I'm just taking notes, so I'm making sure.
No, I would be interested in that. I'm just like from the top of my head, I'm not sure how feasible it is in the current structure of the protocol contract code, given that the bonding manager and the voting and the binding voting systems will likely be totally separated from each other.
Right. Okay, I think I understand. Yeah, I'm not sure how feasible it is either, although I'm certainly interested in it, but it might be useful to separate that idea from this design. Like that's something that could happen regardless of what we decide here.
Yeah, I think that discussion is more something for milestone 3.
One question that I had, which isn't really addressed anywhere, is like, what can happen during this delay period? Like, we don't have any mechanism by which the decision can be like reversed or this staged update can be canceled or anything like that, right? It's purely just, this thing's going to happen, wait and see, it's inevitable.
Well, what you mentioned is not in the prototype, but it's something I've played around with to be able to, like I said, have that higher core to appeal a stage upgrade, and then once you get a higher amount of quorum and a higher amount of acceptance, you can sort of block the earlier proposal. But it's not in the prototype right now, but I think it would be a desirable feature to have. And I think the creation cost for such a proposal down the line, given milestone 3 or 4, would also have to be higher than that of the initial proposal you're going against, of course. But yeah, that would be a desirable feature, I think.
It also gives stakeholders, like other stakeholders, the chance. Like it's not just about exiting the system. It might also be about like preparing, like maybe the changes break something that you've built or impact stakeholders in a way that they need to be educated. So it gives everyone a chance to kind of like know what's happening before it happens.
Yeah,
Very good point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think we have like a real example of how that's tricky, right? Where when we did the Streamflow upgrade, we communicated a ballpark time when the upgrade was going to happen. but it was very ad hoc. It wasn't something that was like set in stone. It was something that was only verbally and socially communicated. What this would mean is it just gives everyone clear, clear absolute transparency on when something is going to happen definitively so that they can prepare for it themselves. So I think that's actually like a pretty compelling reason, actually.
Well, last question on this front is just around like the upgradability of this contract itself. Can you remind me like what the process would be to upgrade this contract to do something like enable that sort of like staged update appeals court process in the future?
Yeah, right. So the upgrade process for this would be to deploy an entirely new contract and set it as the owner of the controller, as well as as the owner of the controller. And then once the new deployment has happened, set the necessary access rights for that new deployment after migration.
Right. So deploy a new contract, set the access rights, get it configured, and then whatever mechanism enables like the set owner function to be called, whether it's the binding voting system or the multi-sig.
That would have to be called indeed by an actor on the governance contract itself, and which right. one that is indeed decided by the ACL, of course. So that could be a binding voting system, but that could also be the live peering multi-sig.
Okay.
One question that I had about the initial parameters is that I see that there's so I think we're on the same page about the benefits of a modular delay, but I think it's interesting that it's noted that the multi-sig will retain the ability to perform code upgrades with no delay, but it executes parameter updates with a delay. And I think that's interesting because the scope of code upgrades is strictly larger than parameter updates. And in theory, anything that you want to do with a parameter update, you can also, like any behavioral change you can do with a parameter update, you can do with a code upgrade, because code upgrade allows you to literally do anything. So I think it's worth considering, like, if the motivation behind this modular delay is to like restrict the power of the multi-sig a little bit, whether it makes sense to give ability to do code upgrades without a delay. So yeah, that's a point that I think is worthwhile considering.
So your question is to whether or not allow the live peering multisig to execute code updates on a delay or not, right?
Yeah, I would rephrase this as just like a point that I think we should consider as opposed to a question. My current inclination is not to allow code upgrades without a delay, and that simply because they are strictly more powerful than parameter updates. So it doesn't feel like it makes sense to give something a delay, give something no delay when it's strictly more powerful than something that you are giving a delay for. That's my own personal view, and I'm just bringing up the point that I think this is worth considering, and the reason why it's a little weird to have code upgrades with no delay, but parameter updates with a delay.
Mm-hmm. Good point. I guess the idea here was that we're still allowed to fix bugs pretty rapidly if they should occur. Although yeah, it's questionable if that should be the case. But you could also argue, for example, let's say a contract is upgraded to, but true, and it uses like the proxy system, so it still has the old state, but the code is actually new. You would have a new address. I think you would have the same address for the ACL, right? So you wouldn't be able to set parameters if you weren't allowed to previously, and the parameter itself would still be the same after deployment, right?
Not for So for any of the delegate proxies, a code upgrade would swap out the implementation contract, and the proxy is still the one that has all the relevant permissions and stores all the relevant state. So if you have the ability to change the implementation contract, then you can change anything about the proxy.
Right. Mm, right. I wonder if there's something we could do to avoid that though. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I still, yeah, it's like a matter of how desirable would it be for LivePeer Inc. to still be able to perform instant upgrades to the protocol if necessary.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the best idea, but my current thought is like something that we could consider is there being a delay for code upgrades, but it's not as long as the delay for parameter updates. That's one thing we can consider. And I think the other thing to just keep in mind is that with the ability to pause and unpause, you still have the benefit of the pause and unpause is that you can still prevent bad things from happening if you discover a major bug that would compromise user funds. The negative, without the ability to do upgrades really quickly, is that there's going, depending on how long the pause lasts, you lose out on inflationary rewards, and you also, yeah, the contracts are non-functional. So that's definitely a downside. But it's worth highlighting that you still have the ability to make sure that no funds are lost explicitly, although you can certainly consider the loss of inflation rewards as like a non-explicit loss of funds. So I think those are all things that are worth considering here.
Although I don't think it's necessarily a loss of inflationary rewards, right? It just gets postponed until the protocol is unpaused.
I mean,
it's a little sense of time value of money, but in essence, you're still getting it.
I mean, I think this is like a user perception thing, right? Like if there is a certain if there's a certain inflation schedule and it is not met and you don't earn the value that you thought you were entitled to earn, that you projected to earn on a particular day, it doesn't matter like that you get it eventually, like the perception is still changed.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But anywho, I don't have a good solution for this right now, but I think I just wanted to highlight that, and I think it's worth spending some time thinking about that, particularly for the initial parameters decision.
Sorry. I would also be interested in kind of what the community thinks here, I guess. Would they want LivePeer Inc. to still be able to execute code upgrades instantly to resolve potential bugs, or do they think the protocol is at like a mature enough state where that isn't needed and we can have some sort of time delay for those things? That's something I would also be interested in.
So that was the topic I was going to bring up for the during the open discussion for an agenda item for next conversation, which is, okay, with this kind of modular access control list pattern and this role-based system, should we formalize the role of a, let's call it, security council or security committee, if you will, propose initial params of what's suggested here, like that committee can update the code and whatnot without any delay, and press pause without any delay. And maybe it's not even a committee, maybe it's just simplified to elect the smart contract address that has the ability to do that. In this case, it would be a multi-sig, and then any upgrades to that role could be invoked via this governance process itself, which would enable you to like elect a different multi-sig with additional actors, or move it over to a smart contract, or set it to the null address so it's not possible. But just with this new framework in mind, should we move to like formalize the fact that that is something that the community like enacted and elected via a vote versus something that was just handed down as legacy from the origins of the protocol? So we don't have to discuss it in depth now, but I think that's like the agenda item I would add for next time.
I think it's an interesting idea. One thing that kind of concerns me is that we haven't really talked about what a governance consortium would look like if it would ever evolve to that in the short term. Like if the governance process would decide, we would rather have the LivePeer Inc. multisig with some additional prominent community members as actors rather than just the LivePeer Inc. multisig. And then what that implies for the governance power of those participants in that consortium. I think that's something that needs to be considered and discussed, and I wouldn't jump to decisions there if we can avoid it.
I think it's worth highlighting that like I feel like what Doug described about formalizing the notion of a security committee is just another way to describe what we've been describing in this call, which is in the initial parameter discussion, the LivePeer multisig is highlighted as having X, Y, and Z privileges. And I think in the GitHub issue, it's described as an owner, also an admin. But you could also just change the words you use to describe that multisig and say that, no, it's actually a security committee. And that's why it has these privileges. So I think, yeah, I feel like it's we should choose how we describe this carefully. But I think it's worth noting that like, yeah, security committee is just is a nicer term for what we've been talking about all along. And then it might also be helpful for when putting it up to a vote or a poll, because the details of the poll will include this new system, and it also gives the community the option to say like, I'm okay with this address being like the security committee role in the Genesis version of this system.
Right, yeah, that's more what I'm getting towards, which is just like community opt-in for the status quo as the default starting point, rather than the grand debate, which is like, what is the ideal way to construct a security committee for the long term, which is something that could also be happening in parallel or later. But yeah, let's think more deeply about it and talk about it next week or in 2 weeks.
Cool. So we have a couple minutes left in the hour. I have written down as to-dos for next time based on this conversation, researching the role-based authentication implementations and seeing whether we can use open source implementations and how generic they are. The second one is, based on that research, decide how we would want to implement the modular delay. And then the last one is for the agenda next time, consider formalizing the notion of a security committee that the community can opt into with this specific proposal. Am I missing anything there? Does anyone think that there's anything else that we discussed that constitutes a to-do item? Great. I think with that, then with the remaining time that we have, we can kick off the open discussion period. If anyone has anything that they want to bring up that they want to have added to the agenda for the next call, anything that they want to highlight so that people can keep on their minds. We won't have time to talk about them right now, but it would be good to at least bring up ideas that people want more attention about.
Have we spent any more thought about using the current polling system as a sentiment gauging system, as we discussed in the previous LIP call? Has anyone considered that any further? I know I haven't, so I'm asking if someone
Yeah,
else.
so in the last call, we said that would be a topic for this week if there was like a champion with a specific proposal. And pretty like a couple days after the last call, I shared maybe with Yandin, I was like, you know, I was thinking about that more. It felt like we're like navel gazing a little bit and being a little theoretical about possibilities for doing this. Let's start by just lighter weight, trying to engage the community to give feedback around actual ideas or proposals that people are pressing forward. So we agreed to do some forum posts and archive some of the existing discussion and try and see if, you know, people are engaging around those topics. And we said, well, that's a good first step. I'm not going to like champion this and kick off a huge work stream in terms of like creating sentiment polls if there's not yet these like contentious topics that people are actively engaging around anyway.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Yeah.
So,
Go
something
ahead, Gavin.
something I thought of. It could be for the existing poll. I mean, I guess you still need an LIP for to put an existing poll on chain. But you know, rather than just having yes or no as an option, like it might be nice to be able to give like a numbered option, so that people could pay LIP tokens to see if people prefer one option over another option.
Is just to make sure I understand correctly, is it kind of like instead of it being binary, you just give like a rank, and there's multiple options, you give like a ranked choice list where it's like, I like this over this over this?
Yeah, that's even better. Maybe a rank choice. But I realized that if you were trying, like right now it's like yes or no, but if you were trying to decide like between competing things, it would be kind of hard to do, to gauge sentiment for that, or at least to gather signal for that.
Right. I guess, yeah, it's a little harder. I could see that being really useful from like a sentiment standpoint, but harder from like a binary should this be done or not standpoint. It does kind of remind me of I think something that the MakerDAO governance system does, which is a little different from how our polling system works, but I believe they have I think they have a continuous voting system where like you have a set of proposals where it's not like, oh, I put up these set of proposals today and we have X period of time to vote on them, but rather it was like proposals are constantly going up and people are moving their support from individual proposals such that you end up with like a list of proposals that have like, this one has X support, Y support, Z support, and you end up with like an ordered list of how much support each proposal has. And then it's the top proposal after some time ends up being executed. I think that's how it works in MakerDAO, or I might be thinking about a different system, but that might be like an interesting way to consider how to incorporate this like ranked choice feature into decision making.
Oh, cool. Take a look at that. Thanks.
Cool. I don't have anything myself, so if that's it for today, then I think we can just end the call here, 2 minutes early.
Let's wrap it.
Good.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.
Yeah.